Welcome to the 2024 Phish Studies Conference Video Archive. The Mockingbird Foundation is thrilled and proud to present this groundbreaking video series on our YouTube channel. It continues our tradition of celebrating music education. Since 1996, we have been an all-volunteer nonprofit organization dedicated to broadening access to educational opportunities for youth in music and the musical arts. Please visit mbird.org to donate today.
All right, good morning, everybody. Hope you all have been having a good conference. I'm Kristine Albach. I'm Director of Theater at University of Pittsburgh at Greensburg, and I am the moderator for this panel, which is I'm Leaving You a Message, Literary Analysis 1. And we want to thank our sponsor for this panel, which is the OSU School of Visual, Performing, and Design Arts. Today we have 3 papers for you. We have John Michael DiResta. John Michael DiResta is a theater director, dramaturg, adapter, playwright, and assistant professor at Skidmore College. His work focuses on new play dramaturgy, psyched responsive theater, community engagement, and queer liberation. Our second presenter is Hunter Phillips. Hunter is an English PhD student at Cornell University studying the intersections of gender, sexuality, and medicine in medieval literature. And our final presenter today is Kristine Warrenburg-Rome. Kristine Warrenburg-Rome, PhD, is a cultural rhetoric critic with concern for communication ethics and an associate professor of communication for Flagler College since 2009. Her first Phish show was Deer Creek Music Center, Noblesville, Indiana, Monday, August 12, 1996. And you can read some of her research in the special issue of the Public Philosophy Journal, Volume 4, Number 3, Phish. And let's start. Our first presenter is John Michael DiResta. It Will All Feel New, Structural Evolutions in the Dramatic Arcs of Phish. And we will allow time for 1 or 2 questions after each paper. And when all papers are finished, we can open up the entire room to some questions. All right, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Let's see if we can get this going. Y'all came to a conference presentation at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning. You win. Thank you so much for being here. There we go. Awesome. Okay, great. So, I'm going to talk a little bit today about storytelling. The major musical influences that help create Trey's sound are really well documented. We know when we think about the composers, the guitarists, the songwriters that help mold him, we think about Frank Zappa, we think about Stravinsky, we think about Jerry Garcia, Ernie Stiers, Robert Fripp, Jimi Hendrix, many, many others. What is a little bit, so within this diverse group, there's a real influence of musical theater. He really drew a lot of inspiration from Leonard Bernstein. He drew a lot of inspiration from Cole Porter. He went to see Broadway musicals as a child. His family listened to cast recordings on vinyl. And he's actually in particular spoken a lot about the influence that West Side Story had on him, which I'll get back to in a little bit and would like to nominate for a future Halloween costume. So I am a theater professor. I'm a professional stage director. I'm actually a lot less interested in what's influenced Trey's sound and a lot more interested in what's influenced his storytelling. And I argue that over the course of his career, Trey has evolved from one kind of theatrical storyteller to another kind of theatrical storyteller. His early songs reverberate with the influences of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle and his literary treatise, The Poetics. Aristotle's influence on modern storytelling reverberates across genres. If you can think of a play, a musical, a movie, even a rock opera from the last 100 years or so, last couple hundred years, it probably follows Aristotelian form, which I will unpack in a little bit. Trey's early songwriting follows Aristotelian form, often down to the letter of the formula. But over the last decade, Trey's narrative structures have transitioned away from ancient Greek dramatic structure of Aristotle and the Poetics to a more recent embrace of the German modernist playwright and director Bertolt Brecht. The influence of Brecht is really widely felt across different genres of contemporary storytelling, but he is less widely known. So if you are wondering who's Brecht, don't feel bad. If Trey were with us today, he might stand up and say, I have no idea who Bertolt Brecht is. How can he be an influence on me? The answer to that question, as many answers to many Phish questions can be found, thank you, can be found in the 80s in Vermont. But I will unpack that in a little bit. Let's first go back to ancient Greece. So Aristotle, he is considered the first Western literary critic, although literature and theater were just one of his purviews. He also wrote about ethics, he wrote about politics, rhetoric, even zoology. Aristotle's theory of theater survives in the Poetics, which is a series of lecture notes that have been preserved only in part. In these lectures, he outlines what he believes makes a quote-unquote good drama, and he uses what is now called Aristotelian form. This Aristotelian form has governed most contemporary theater making for the past 3 millennia, as well as plenty of films, novels, comic books, podcasts, etc. Aristotelian form lines out the necessary ingredients for a good drama, and it delineates the dramatic arc that plays should follow. It begins with an argument for the value of mimesis, which roughly translate as imitation, or what we today might just call acting. Aristotle also maps out the structure of an effective drama. It begins with a status quo or a stasis, which is the world at rest, which is interrupted with an inciting incident. This inciting incident then develops over the course of a series of rising events, which we call the rising action, which eventually are followed by a climax and conclude with a denouement, which is an establishment of a new stasis. Aristotle also argues that a good climax for a play must include a dramatic reversal in which the fortunes of the characters are reversed, usually through a surprise. It often involves a gigantic emotional release for both the people on stage and the people in the audience, which is called a catharsis. This reversal is pretty endemic to all major Western drama, at least until the beginning of the 20th century, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But Hamlet, Romeo and Juliet, A Streetcar Named Desire, aforementioned West Side Story, A Raisin in the Sun, The Lion King, The Shawshank Redemption, the Barbie movie. I can keep going and going and going and going and going, and if you can think of movies, they probably fall in here as well. They're all Aristotelian. Anything that has that sort of structure qualifies as Aristotelian, including a lot of Trey's early songs. Now, I found out something really interesting while I was getting ready for this presentation. If we look at Junta, there are only 4 songs on that album that contain more than 9 consistent lyrics in the English language that were written after Trey finished middle school. And they are Fee, Esther, Foam, and Fluffhead. So of those 4, 2 of them follow Aristotelian form perfectly, Esther and Fee. Each of these starts with a world at rest in the cool shade of the banana tree for Fee, late one dark night in a fairground near town for Esther. Each has an inciting incident, Fee meeting Millie in the bar in Peru, Esther taking the doll from the Armenian man, that leads to a series of events that constitute a rising action, Floyd attacking Fee, the Herculean list of ordeals that Esther must overcome. This action ends with a climax, Millie slicing Floyd on the nipple, Esther realizing she must jump into the frigid waters with the puppet, and a catharsis that has a reversal that establishes a new stasis. Millie knew the weasel was finally free, and Esther was, well, dead. It's not just on Junta that we see this dramatic structure as well. Some might describe Alumni Blues as inane, but it actually tells a sequential rising story that ends with a cathartic reversal. Harpua included a different Aristotelian story at almost every early 90s performance. Bathtub Gin is straight up Aristotelian in its plotline, and it also doubly proves Aristotle's theory of the value of catharsis with its joyful moment of audience emotional release as we sing We Love to Take a Bath. And even Cavern follows a rising narrative arc triggered by an inciting incident. This is really especially true in the original lyrics. I turned the blade back on the bitch and dropped her in the dung makes me pretty squeamish in its misogyny, but it is still a reversal that leads to a climax and establishes a new stasis. I will also go a little bit astray here and say that Trey's early compositional writing, especially the material that didn't have lyrics, also really follows Aristotelian form. You Enjoy Myself, for example, it starts with a stasis. The stasis is interrupted. There's then a rising action, there's a climax, and with the vocal jam, there's a denouement and an establishment of a new stasis. This is true for Reba, too. The whistling, the reprise, a climax, a denouement, a new stasis. And if you look at early songs like Harry Hood, Slave to the Traffic Light, when they close sets and they have those long outros, again, we've got this Aristotelian form. But to get back to lyrics for a second, the actual real Aristotelian juggernaut of early Trey is found in more than in individual songs. In another part of the Poetics, Aristotle delineates what he believes are the 6 ingredients of a good drama, and they are plot, characters, verbal expression, debate, spectacle, and song. We'll read those again. Plot, character, verbal expression, debate, spectacle, and song. So, like most contemporary heroes' journeys, from Arthur Miller's The Crucible to Disney's The Little Mermaid, Gamehenge adheres to Aristotelian form in both its dramatic arc and its employment of these 6 elements of drama. Plot, characters, verbal expression, debate, spectacle, song, they're all there. The stasis of the lizards' lives is interrupted with the arrival of Wilson. The rising action grows as Colonel Forbin arrives in Gamehenge. Mr. Palmer is executed. Aaron Wolf attempts espionage, etc., etc. What is missing from Gamehenge, though, is a clear climax, catharsis, and establishment of a new stasis. This is even further complicated by the fact that in every live performance of Gamehenge, the story ends a little bit differently. So, can it truly be called Aristotelian? Trey put Gamehenge to bed for 30 years, so before I get there, I'm going to put a quick pause on it, and we're going to go a little bit of our ways through the 90s. We'll come back to Gamehenge in a bit. As the 90s go on, Trey really begins to move away from the Aristotelian narratives of his early songs, and he shifts into being more of a contemplative lyricist, a little bit more meditative. This is true for Tom's lyrics as well. The concept album of Rift, it tells a narrative story, but it is not Aristotelian, it's surrealist. Trey shifts away from Aristotelian form, especially in the rewriting of the lyrics of Axilla. Part 1 has Aristotelian elements to its narrative development, Part 2 does not. And by the 90s, we're really in a moment of meditative, not narrative form. Julius Free, Theme from the Bottom, Twist Around, these are all Aristotelian, these are all anti-Aristotelian form. These are songs that are meditative, that are poetic, that are lyrical. Of course, this is no better demonstrated than in the greatest lyric Trey ever wrote. This is a moment in which Trey is actually less interested in the arc. Now, interestingly, at the same time, Mike writes 2 straight-up traditional Aristotelian form songs, Destiny Unbound, Son of a Mule. They follow the Aristotelian structure perfectly. If you want some extra credit, you can map it out, leave it under my name at the Hilton Garden Inn. But let's get back to the theater for a second, and let's go to Germany. So Bertolt Brecht, he's born in 1898. He comes to prominence as a playwright and a director at the height of Weimar Germany in the 1920s. Some of his most famous works include The Threepenny Opera, Mother Courage and Her Children, The Good Person of Sichuan. Brecht was interested in politics, not emotionality, and he hated the idea of a play leading to catharsis. He was unapologetically Marxist, and he strove to enact political change through his theater that would society implement Marxism. He was also really bravely anti-Nazi at a time when being anti-Nazi was extremely dangerous. He went so far as to write Hitler into his play, The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui, as a dangerous dictator who must be stopped. Brecht rejected Aristotelian form. He demanded that plays be written and staged in a way that didn't aim to create catharsis, but instead provided the audience with the tools that they needed to enact change in society. He did this with what he termed epic theater, which was built upon the foundation of what Brecht called, and forgive my German, Verströmungseffekt. This word has a number of translations, including its most common, which is alienation effect. The translation that I actually like, though, is not alienation effect, but actually the verb or the concept of making strange. Brecht wanted seismic productions that made the experience of going to the theater strange for the audience, to shake them out of their comfort. His ingredients for epic theater and for Verströmungseffekt couldn't have been more different than Aristotle's, because he rejected mimesis or imitation outright. He didn't want you to think you weren't seeing a play. Brecht said that theater should instead, 1, abandon plots driven by writhing action, 2, create stories that focus on the choices that humans must make, 3, inspire audiences to discuss how things might have been or could have been done differently, and 4, expose the apparatus of the theater to show its illusion by literally revealing the backstage, the catwalks, the rigging, etc. I really love this picture from this production of Arturo because we see in here, we know we're in a theater. We can see the scaffolding. We see the extra scenery in the back. These actors are not in any way, shape, or form attempting to act like real human beings. We're meant to embrace the artifice of it, which is a real bedrock of Brecht's approach to theater. Aristotle said that the theater should make you feel. Brecht said that the theater should make you learn. So we see this Brechtian manifestation in Phish's storytelling all over 3.0. It first appears physically. Chilling Thrilling, Cats What Fox, Sci-Fi Soldier. They're not about Brecht's political goals, but they are all staged as Brechtian epic theater. The audience saw the sets be physically built during set break. The scenic design of all 3 productions allowed the theatrical machinery to be revealed. There was a clear acknowledgement that the proceedings were meant to be theatrical artifice. There was no mimetion or imitation at all. We were not actually meant to think that Trey and Mike had become alien soldiers flying in from another planet. We're acknowledging, okay, this is artifice. But the real place in which we see Brechtian form in contemporary Trey is in the lyrics. An interesting thing has happened over the last decade or so, which is that as he did in the very, very early days of Phish, Trey has returned to being the band's principal lyric writer. And even some of the lyrics that come from Tom also adopt this Brechtian approach. I don't think we have seen an Aristotelian Phish song since Steam in 2011. If you keep in mind that Brecht wanted theater to teach, not emote, take a look at some of the titles of the most frequently played songs of the last decade. Set Your Soul Free, Drift While You're Sleeping, Blaze On, Evolve, Rise, Come Together. They are all direct instructions. They're all in the vocative case. They're all orders. There is no narrative to any of these songs. There's an invitation to learn. They ask the audience to make change, as Brecht wanted his plays to do. This ethos extends to other recent 3.0 songs like Everything's Right, A Life Beyond the Dream, Sigma Oasis, A Wave of Hope, etc., all of which invite the audience to reflect on their lives and enact change. It's also worth noting here that Trey's one Broadway foray, Hands on a Hard Body in 2013, exhibits many of the trappings of Brechtian theater as well, but since Trey didn't actually write the lyrics for that musical, I'm going to leave it aside for the time being. I just couldn't give a presentation on Phish and theater and not talk about Trey's Broadway show. So I have not been able to find any evidence of Trey ever directly speaking about Bertolt Brecht. I will also say that there's not really any documentation of Trey engaging with Aristotle, but the pervasiveness of Aristotelian form is wider than Brechtian, so we can assume that he absorbed it through some sort of other avenue. So, how does an artist who is not engaged with Brecht become so inherently Brechtian in his recent work? The answer lies, as many Phish answers do, in Vermont in the 1980s. Since the 70s, Peter Schumann's Bread and Puppet Theater has staged gigantic, public, free pageant plays called Resurrection Circuses every summer in Vermont. Jesse Jarnow chronicles the impact of Bread and Puppet on Phish in his really incredible book, Heads, which I can't recommend enough that everyone read, where Trey explains his experience at festivals by saying, "It was quiet. Everyone would sit in silence, and the pageant would come over the hill. It would have a theme, and it was so moving and memorable and emotional. It's a different delivery of experience where time slows down." This description is the making strange of theater that Brecht argued for. At these Resurrection Circuses, Trey was continuously introduced to Schumann's interpretation of Brechtian theater in the height of the 80s. And I would also add in the height of 80s Reaganite capitalism. Schumann's production echoed Brecht's political and educative approach, rejecting Aristotelian mimesis, embracing the physical and instructive elements of epic theater. Sometimes Schumann would stage entire Brecht plays, which Trey may have seen, but even if he wasn't engaging directly with the Brecht play, he was engaging with the ethos. The oversized puppets on parade that you see here, the homespun nature, the fact that he did nothing to hide the machinery of the theater, keeping things lo-fi. This is all Brechtian. In addition, Schumann employed Brecht's Marxist approach to theater making by taking it outdoors, not charging admission, and providing a meal to every attendee. Much of the ethos of Phish festivals and the festival circuit that they inspired can be traced to Bread and Puppet's annual summer festivals. And after attending many of these resurrection circuses, Bread and Puppet ultimately actually became part of the Phish community when Russ Bennett joined their team. Russ Bennett was one of the designers and directors of the original Bread and Puppet, or Bread and Puppet in the 80s in Vermont, and he then became part of the Phish team and has done art direction for a number of Phish festivals in addition to Bonnaroo, and has thus created the contemporary music circuit as we know it. So to get back to Brecht's interest in Marxism and the implementation of Marxism, if you went to the Sphere, you probably recognize that Phish is not particularly interested in Marxism right now. That is not part of the contemporary performance practice. I hope you all had a wonderful time. Not jealous. So it was once. If we look at Phish in the mid-90s, the insistence of covering up the ads in the arenas before the first set started. This was a Brechtian Marxist approach to performance making. That has gone to bed in many ways. But the aesthetic and the educative as opposed to narrative storytelling has really been pervasive in recent years, nowhere better than on April 22nd, 2022 at the Earth Day concert. The band uses enormous puppets in the form of drone-powered whales and dolphins. They turn Madison Square Garden into a gigantic aquarium. There's a pageant bolstered by the lyrics of songs like A Wave of Hope and Sand, which rejects the Aristotelian narrative found in Gamehenge. Earth Day Phish achieve Brecht's epic theater goals, in this case teaching the audience about climate change and inviting them to consider their role in it by employing the meta-theatricality of Bread and Puppet theater. So when I first submitted this paper, I was supposed to stop here. And then something happened on New Year's Eve. So I will share here the text message that my husband sent to my best friend at the end of Harpua on 12/31/23. This is catharsis. But he left out a little bit of a detail, which was that halfway through Trey's solo in Lizards, I leaned over to him and I said, I have to rethink my entire argument for the Phish Studies conference. We were, it seemed, back to the land of Aristotle. The incorporation of Punch You in the Eye, Llama, and McGrupp and the Watchful Hosemusters and their new story and the spots in the story of Gamehenge codified the sequential rising action of the story, which manifested physically in Colonel Forbin's literal climb up the rhombus's incline. Joe Lampert's extraordinary performance as Aaron Wolf was rooted in mimetic imitative acting. The costumes for Aaron, for Wilson, for the Lizards, for Rutherford were all Aristotelian mimesis. The famous Mockingbird retrieved the Helping Friendly book at midnight, which led to the kind of audience catharsis that Aristotle wrote about 3 millennia ago. But then, out of nowhere, as we approach the establishment of a new stasis, Trey tells us that the mountain in Gamehenge was actually a volcano, and he went in to split open and melt, a song that is miles away from the traditional Gamehenge narrative. The lizards slithered and danced, Aaron Wolf inexplicably returned to the stage to dance with them, and the volcano destroyed the rhombus and its manifestation of rising action. This is similar to other artistic impulses that Phish has shown in the past to interrupt the rising action of a narrative and instead just sort of burn it down. We see it at the Clifford Ball in '96 with the unfinished Harpua, at the Great Went in '97 with the burning of the art installation. I argue that the narrative interjection of the volcano into Gamehenge on 12/31/23, which makes strange the story of Gamehenge in a new era, not only counteracted the return to Aristotelian structure that the revival of Gamehenge may have otherwise signaled, but actually returned audiences to the geological ethos of the Earth Day show in 2022, a moment of Vertiumdungsteffekt, which brought us back to 3.0's current Brechtian form. Thank you so much.
All right, we can have 1 or 2 questions for John about his paper, if anyone has any. Jake, yeah, that microphone's on.
Thank you so much, John. This was really lovely. I wanted to ask about the point that you made earlier about the music also being Aristotelian, and I think you're right on with that. And I'm curious about the sort of narrative structure that is sort of endemic to Phish songs, which is that they peak.
Yeah.
Right? And that seems inevitably sort of Aristotelian, or at the very least kind of romantic, right? And, Brecht rejecting, I think of like Adorno rejecting, the sort of romanticism in music of the 19th century, because he saw that as leading to the Third Reich. And I'm curious about, like, is there a way in which, and you don't have to answer this right now because it's, might have to think about it and
Sure.
stuff, but like, are there examples where you see in like 3.0 especially more, that the music and the instrumental narrative structures have become less teleological, less sort of romantically goal-oriented, and therefore leading to climax and catharsis?
Not a plant. That was the one thing I didn't have time for that I've noticed recently, and in particular after Mexico, I really noticed this. If we look at, and I'm gonna talk a little bit more about improvisation than the composed parts of Trey's work.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to.
Great. If you look at sort of like the great 1.0 jams, they are attention and release. They're arc. They build, they build, they build, they build. If you look at like the Riverport Gin, if you look at Mud Island, if you look at the Providence Bowie, all of these jams, I think that for the most part, there's like a very, very slow build to them, and ultimately there's like a real climax to them. I'm thinking in particular about the Riverport Gin here. And then after those climaxes, there's sort of a briefer outro. That's what Aristotle argued for. One of the things I didn't get into with Brecht is that Brecht really argued for episodic theater. He thought that plays should have many, many plot lines so audiences could find something to latch onto, and that those plot lines should intersect with each other and overlap each other, which to me, if you listen to the recent Chalk Dust from Mexico, that is an episodic jam. We're going from movement to movement to movement, and there's not nearly as much of an interest in, okay, let's do a crescendo. And I actually think that's relatively recent. I think that if we want to call it 4.0, in many ways that's a 4.0 thing, because if you listen to Tweezer from the New Year's run in 2019, that's Aristotelian. Like, that is just, it's peaking and peaking, it's building, it's building, it's building. But when I think about certainly the Mexico Chalk Dust, when I think about a lot of the jams from the New Year's run last year, they're episodic. They're just like, okay, here's a movement, here's a new movement. That's Brechtian.
I'd argue there's traces of that earlier in 3.0 too.
Sure.
Think of like the Chalk Dust from Dick's 2012,
yes.
or the
Yes.
Hampton 13 Tweezer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any more? If not, we'll move on to, thank you, John. We'll move on to Hunter Phillips, reading the Helping Friendly book, Phish Performance as Literature.
Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you, John. That was wonderful, and I realize it already has so many resonances and implications for my own talk. So that was really wonderful. I'd also like to just start by first thanking the conference organizers, and Stephanie in particular, for all the effort that they put in to making this happen, and to Oregon State for providing the space for this conference. I'd like to start by mentioning that I have slightly changed my title, and it is now Reading the Helping Friendly Book, Lyric, Narrative, and Temporality in Phish Performance, as a reflection of my slightly narrower focus, and consequently I will be discussing only several of the things that I hinted at in my abstract, as I quickly realized in writing this paper that my eyes were bigger than my stomach, and my initial proposal was a bit too much for a 20-minute presentation. Also, I want to mention that in my day job, I am a medievalist by trade, and right now I'm about 1,000 years removed from my academic comfort zone. So I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to present on these rather random thoughts I've been having about my favorite band, and I welcome any and all feedback, as these ideas are very much in nuce. Finally, I just want to also apologize for not having slides. This has been a very chaotic end to my semester in graduate school, so I'm running from one conference to the next. I didn't have the time to make the slides that I really wanted to, and I apologize for that. So I'd like to begin, in keeping with my literary focus, with a story. The idea for this paper started almost a year ago. It was a sunny day, summer, July 4th to be exact, and I was visiting my close friends at their lake house on Seneca Lake, one of the Finger Lakes of western New York. Towards the end of the day, I was regaling my friend Will and his father Bill about my upcoming trip to Syracuse on July 23rd to see Phish play at St. Joseph's Amphitheater, starting a conversation about my love of Phish and jam band music that would end with his dad making a joke I am sure many of us here are familiar with. Quote, "I don't know how you could listen to that music," he says. "It goes on forever. It's more like watching a movie or reading a book than it is listening to music," end quote. While this sentiment from people outside the community is far from surprising and has never really offended me, something about the qualification of Phish's music as a kind of long-form story actually struck me, and I immediately responded, "Yes, and that's exactly why I love it." Indeed, there does seem to be this storytelling element to improvisational music. Whether in Phish's domain or not, we often intuitively remark on jams going somewhere, as we just heard, or following a particular thematic path. Whether it's the dark recesses of a split open and melt jam or the soaring bliss of Harry Hood, generic qualifications that we might use with regard to other forms, such as describing a movie or a video game as grimdark, that is something that is particularly heavy, violent, or dystopian, could just as easily be applied to certain Carini jams, insofar as the aesthetic experience of Trey's dissonant guitar whirls paired with Fishman's crashing cymbal playing and Page's haunting trills on the keyboard places you in a particular environment that we can all identify as scary, bleak, and thrilling. It feels as though we are being pulled through a stressful story, hanging on the edges of our seats, just as when we read a book or see a movie. This sensation of the Phish experience is a kind of thematic story, importantly one in which we experience with the band in real time, is why my favorite opening to a Phish.net song history is Harpua's. Quote, "This, along with Colonel Forbin's Ascent, is one of the few songs where Trey tells us a story. Phish fans are like kids at bedtime. Tell us a story, Uncle Trey, we cry. When he delivers, it's always worthwhile," end quote. While, as I hope to show in this paper, every Phish song and performance can be seen from the lens of Trey and the band telling us a story, I love this description so much because it points to what I have already introduced, that part of the joy of the Phish experience is being told a story, in particular a story we have never heard before and will never quite hear the same way again. Hence, too, why when an unknowing fan asks a veteran tour follower to his right during You Enjoy Myself why Trey and Mike are bouncing on trampolines, they are told with a smile, read the book. What does it mean truly then to read the story that is Phish as set down in the Helping Friendly book? I take up this question in this paper, in which I will analyze a portion of a famous set from Phish's performance history through the lens of lyric and narrative theory. The story that Phish tells, I will argue, is one that has much in common with narrative and lyric poetic form. I hope to do several things with this. First and foremost, I aim to contribute to the growing body of work initiated by the first conference in 2019 and the subsequent special Phish edition of the Public Philosophy Journal of unpacking and exploring in concrete terms how Phish achieves effects that we so often struggle to articulate in the moment. Secondly, I hope to bring the field of literary studies closer together with that of music studies and musicology. To me, it is fundamentally misguided to read any hard barrier between a song and a lyric poem, even while we rightly discern and appreciate the differences between the two. Each is a phenomenon, as Jonathan Culler puts it, where sound and rhythm rather than meaning are the source of attraction. Yet Culler and other theorists of lyric, especially those in the field of new lyric studies, continue to relegate what we would call lyric to the domain of language and written poetry, despite their continued emphasis on rhythm and sound as constitutive elements of lyric poetry. Likewise, there is a continued assumption that we need to classify all poems as either lyric or narrative, when in fact we often find narrative elements in lyric and lyrical moments in narrative poetry. In bringing lyric and narrative theory to bear on Phish improvisation, then, I will look at the second set of November 14th, 1995, the infamous Stash Sandwich. I choose this set not because it is unique, but because it is exemplary and demonstrates both how nonverbal instrumental jams can function lyrically and how we can understand the story that is a Phish performance as a unique combination of what I will call lyric and narrative impulses. Before diving into the sets themselves, I want to lay out exactly what I mean by narrative and lyric impulses, but especially how I am using lyric, which is a much more contested term in poetics than narrative. Within the field of new lyric studies, developments over the last 20 years have located lyric in the sense of lyric poetry, most commonly defined as a short, non-narrative dramatic monologue that expresses the speaker's feelings, as the dominant form of creating and reading poetry. This view has been championed by scholars such as Yopi Prinz and Virginia Jackson, who see in pre-modernity a vast array of genre diversity that in the early 20th century gets compressed. And now when we read poems, especially short poems, we universally read them under the rubric of lyric. And yet, at the same time, as Jonathan Culler has pointed out, when we approach a lyric poem, we are so conditioned by the definition of a dramatic, personal speech act that we end up reading it like we read a novel, a narrative, because what we search for is a persona and the meaning behind that persona in relation to a narrative fiction that they are a part of. In this model, to take an example from Phish, this would be like taking character 0 and trying to neatly discern who character 0 is, their exact feelings, their identity, and their complete story, rather than paying attention to other things in the song, such as rhythm and sound patterning. There seems to be a dilemma, then, at the heart of studies of poetry. We are told that we read all poems as lyrics, and yet we are part of an academy that wishes to read all lyric poems from a narrative lens. Less than a true problem, I think this highlights the degree to which narrative and lyric overlap, and Phish performance offers us a seductive way of viewing this. For the purposes of this paper, I'm not sure I need to define narrative for all of you, but I will be using it in my analysis in several ways. By narrative, I mean the particular story a song tells, such as the songs of the Gamehenge saga. Think of the narrative of the Lizards that details Colonel Forbin's entrance to Gamehenge. I also mean by narrative the basic structure of the song, its studio version, if you will. That neat structure provides a cohesive unit or a typical narrative for how the song is played. By narrative, I also mean the thematic arc that an improvisational jam takes, such as the steady, blissful rise of Theme from the Bottom or Harry Hood. Finally, we can think of whole sets, shows, or even tours as telling a particular story, hence the Phish Destroys America tour of '97, or a set that begins with a tweezer and closes with a tweezer reprise. Such sandwiches, as I'll be looking at with the Stash sandwich, have a beginning, middle, and end, marked on either end by tweezer, and thus have a kind of narrative arc to them. Or we can think about the thematic story of the Sphere shows that Benji perfectly narrated yesterday. But each of these so-called narratives are constantly broken up by what I call lyric impulses. Here I use lyric in several specific ways. Moving beyond the theory of lyric as a dramatic monologue, I identify lyric as constituted by three things. First, lyric is based in sound and rhythm, what Culler calls jingles, limericks, nursery rhymes, counting rhymes, etc. Think here of the lyric jingles from Phish songs that we love to repeat, like "Whatever You Do, Take Care of Your Shoes," or the iconic openings to songs like Mike's Song that get stuck like jingles in our head, and thus here too can lyric function within written lyrics as well as instrumental jams, speaking to the shared quality of a short, catchy phrase, whether written or musical. From the ashes of a torching, life-saving gun jam, the tagline or melody of the song returns like a poem's lyric refrain. Or within extended jams, like we saw in the wonderful Birds of a Feather guided listening session yesterday, exploratory spaces open up in which the band listens for particular riffs, melodies, or themes to build on. Those themes, I argue, can be understood as lyrical. 2, from this, we see how lyric is atemporal, extractable. The very movability of a lyric is a site of attraction. Hence, we might quote Strange Design and say, "Keep the tires off the line, just relax, you're doing fine," to console a friend, or in a context entirely removed from the song itself, as lyric lines or lyric sounds are not dependent on universal meaning. 3, finally, lyric is about disruption and change. The ability to take up a lyric quote and plop it anywhere necessarily changes the meaning of that lyric in whatever new context it was placed into. Hence, when T.S. Eliot begins his monumental poem, The Wasteland, with "April is the cruelest month," he takes one of the most iconic opening lines in literary history, that of the introduction to Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Quote, "When April with its sweet-smelling showers," end quote. And he inverts it, changing our emotional association with April and spring. This is lyric functioning as illusion as well, something that Phish uses all the time through sampling and teases. What happens in a Phish performance is these lyrical and narrative moments come together to co-shape a particular story and emotional scene. Having set forth the several ways in which I understand narrative and lyric, I'd like to now dive into that set from 1995, one of my favorite sets of all time, the Stash Sandwich. The set itself, described as a must-listen for any serious fan on Phish.net, begins in a psychological blaze of fire with an intense maze, followed by a rather standard gumbo before the band settles into Stash. It is this sandwich of Stash, Manteca, Stash, Dog-Faced Boy, and back into Stash that I will be focusing on. I apologize again here for not having slides. I would have loved to have done a listening session if I had more time, like that was done yesterday, but I'll do my best to describe with time markers how I am understanding the play of narrative and lyric here, and I encourage you all to revisit this masterful set afterwards. Stash itself opens up fairly typically with its absurd yet rhythmic and punctuated lyrics and the constant tug of war between tension and release that defines this song. Yet around the 3:30 mark, we start to notice subtle changes that will influence the way the jam progresses. Trey starts to play these heavily accented staccato notes that add a particular jarring sensation to the piece. Notes that over the course of the 4-minute mark will rise in crescendos until the 5-minute mark, where the band falls into a disjointed, exploratory space, with Trey playing those staccato notes over the other members ominously whispering, maybe so, maybe not. Before this then falls into a particular rock-heavy riff that the others catch onto immediately. Already there are a few key, what I call lyrical moments developing. Trey's staccato playing is a kind of tagline for the opening of the song, creating a broken and uneasy feeling that pairs well with the likewise lyrical, maybe so, maybe not lines, both short rhythmic expressions that create a particular feeling. Soon then, the rock-heavy riff that Trey finds and calls the other members to is a kind of musical lyric, a rhythm that Trey plucks out of the air like a line in a poem. Continuing on, this rock sequence quickly departs back into the realm of tension and release, and we are back on solid Stash ground. And another soft, exploratory space opens up soon, with Trey playing within the Stash key and over the Stash theme. Gradually moving back into Stash proper after that, there's a massive wash of tension and release that occurs around the 10-minute mark onwards, until gradually we fall into a space led first by the return of Trey's staccato notes, but then by Fishman on the cowbell, with the others softly, barely playing in the back, until finally Mike comes plunging in with the bass line for Manteca, and the others follow suit. Here we see Manteca functioning lyrically, intruding in the narrative structure that makes up Stash's traditional song structure, just like the subtle staccato notes were functioning as intrusions upon what could be called a traditional Stash sound, if that even exists. It is this moment that is my favorite, as the band begins to weave the taglines or lyrical cues of Stash, its themes, back into first Manteca and then Dog-Faced Boy. First, Manteca begins to fuse with heavy descending riffs from Trey around the 3-minute mark, recalling the Stash theme in the middle of the song. Around 5 minutes, it becomes atmospheric and opens up before Trey begins to play a completely new and hopeful melody for a minute or two, completely departing from either Stash or Manteca into a new lyrical mode, until he decides to throw the Stash riff back into the equation at around the 9-minute mark, and the tension begins to ramp up. After the song once more again collapses into an otherworldly environment around 12 minutes, setting the stage for the greatest Dog-Faced Boy, in my humble opinion. As Stash melts into Dog-Faced Boy, the band doesn't start their instruments back up. Rather, they carry the atmospheric theme as the basis for Dog-Faced Boy's lyrics in an a cappella mode. Here is lyric as disruptive/changing at its finest. The regular narrative and structure of Dog-Faced Boy is intruded upon by the spacey and haunting theme that I identify here as lyrical of the previous jam, which is itself a further disruption of Stash coming back out of Manteca. Just like Eliot lifts Chaucer's Spring into the wasteland of post-World War I Europe, so does Phish lift Dog-Faced Boy into a new haunting space, and the usually rather upbeat Dog-Faced Boy takes on a much more depressive tone to match its mournful lyrics of a love that was lost. But this was not to be the end. Towards the conclusion of Dog-Faced Boy, Page begins to play a low, rumbling progression of notes that builds to an atonal, dissonant environment from which Trey once more emerges with the Stash theme trickling into existence for a final 2 minutes until it concludes in typical fashion. What is crafted here is a kind of musical experience that we can understand as a blending of narrative and lyric as earlier described. The narrative structure of Stash is constantly being interrupted by lyrical themes, whether it is a rhythm or riff that the band lands on and plays into to set up a jam, or the melody and words of Monteka and Dog-Faced Boy. When all is said and done, we can view this sequence as a cohesive whole, a story that begins and ends with Stash, and that, like a book or movie, explores different emotional themes as it progresses. Yet that narrative is built from moments of lyrical intervention, of unplanned rhythmic and melodic invocations that disrupt smaller kinds of narrative, like the structure of a song, making it incredibly hard to neatly distinguish the narrative from the lyric, as the lyric disruptions are what make up the narrative whole. As a song goes somewhere thematically and tells us a particular story within, but more commonly without, language, it is always threatened by the intrusion of another song, another jam, or another rhythm that functions like a song, like a sonic illusion, a tagline, or a line in a lyric poem. And this is the unknown and surprise that makes Phish such an exciting and unique experience. If, as Mark Abel has argued, the music we listen to reflects how we experience time and construct time in our lives, then Phish's music, as this Stash sequence demonstrates, offers us not only a musical or aesthetic experience, but a philosophy of time dependent on the blending of lyric as the atemporal and intrusive, and narrative as the linear and thematic. And so I want to conclude with a brief note on what I think this ultimately achieves, a philosophy of perspective and identity. To illustrate my point, I turn to perhaps the unlikeliest of places, an epic of the Middle Ages, Chaucer's 14th century Troilus and Cressade, a story itself later adapted by Shakespeare. At the end of this story of love, heartbreak, and death amidst the Trojan War, the protagonist Troilus dies at the hands of the Greek warrior Achilles and is lifted up to outer space, what medieval people referred to as the seventh sphere, though I know many fans who can now also say they were recently lifted up in a massive sphere. In this space, Troilus observes all of time in a single moment, and seeing all the course of his troubled life, reflecting on the betrayal of his lover, and observing those who wept on his behalf, he simply begins to laugh. Outside of time itself, yet viewing its progression in the world, seeing all the suffering of the world, he has escaped it all. And he laughs at the trifle that is life. So too do I, and I imagine many of you find that escape at a Phish show, because its presentation of temporality is much like being pulled out of time. At Phish shows, we are pulled into a story which completely collapses time. We are pulled into themes and jams that are constantly being reshaped and sent into different spaces, so often, in fact, that we are truly being taught to surrender to the flow and experience an ever-moving present that can go forward but also backward, as an unfinished song from earlier in the set rears its head once more. While we can never truly get outside of time like Troilus does, we experience time differently at a Phish show, as our minds attune to the temporality of the music that is fundamentally different to, and I argue even inimical to, the drudgery and linear march of time in a 21st century capitalist world. With this, we are led into a place of total openness and surrender, and are encouraged to see life, if just for a couple hours, from Troilus's perspective. We are led to a place where Phish's disrupted temporality allows us to simply feel in the moment, to laugh like Troilus, but also to cry and to rejoice, with the perspective that the stories of our lives, our shaped identities, are constantly in flux, relational, and shifting, like our favorite Phish Type 2 jams, and that everything is going to be all right. But unlike Troilus, we don't have to wait for the afterlife to experience this. We simply have to go on tour. Thank you.
Any questions for Hunter? One or two questions. If you can come up to the microphone, please.
Hey.
My question goes back to the very beginning of your talk, when you're talking to that person who is like, how can you listen to this, right? Just like, how can anybody sit and listen to an academic talk for 20 minutes, right? So I wanted to know, how do you explain this story structure to somebody like that who's not in the in-group, who doesn't get this stuff just because of their exposure to it?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, for me, I usually just start from the place of recognizing that it is unlike any kind of musical experience that they've probably had up until that point. And so I always start by stressing the difference of what Phish offers and saying, like, look, if you're going into Phish's music from the standpoint of wanting these neat, structured, pop-like songs, like, you're not going to like that. But if you go into it with a completely different perspective that, okay, yeah, maybe it is a story and maybe you're going to experience something that is a lot more loose, open-ended, transformative, then if you go into it with that different mindset, that perhaps you'll be more open to it and will appreciate it more. So I never try to say, like, you know, if you like this particular kind of music, you're going to love Phish. I always want to stress the difference of what Phish offers and to say that if you try thinking about it from this other perspective, you might appreciate it. Yeah,
Anyone else? All right. Thank you, Hunter. Our next paper is Kristine Warrenburg Rome, Phish's Everlasting Spoof, Suspense, Stage Antics, Gags, Humor, and Wit.
Good morning, everybody. So, how's everybody doing? Good. Yeah. So a little bit about the title, I guess. Like it got big ideas, right? Came and I tried to fit everything in, and so suspense for me. I always had this question of, you know, how do they suspend the joke? How's it go on forever? Is it because they've been friends for so long? Why do our friends still have the same jokes? Why do we keep retelling them? So there's something about suspense that's always been in my mind. Stage Antics is one of the other things that I think makes Phish so great. Besides that, it's unpredictable and it's different every night. It's like you were saying, it's the theatrics of it, right, and the storytelling. I brought Gags into it because when I was on Phish.net, like that seemed to be the vernacular of these categories. Like we always talk about the New Year's Eve gags, and then the humor and wit came from when I was trying to find some rhetorical research to make sense of all of this. And when I came across Campbell, he had an article and it was on humor and wit. So that's why it's a little bit lengthy. I'm not sure we're going to get to all of it, but I mean, it's definitely a work in progress. But a little bit about me. Hi, I'm Kristine Warrenburg Rome. I'm an associate professor of communication at Flagler College. That's in St. Augustine, Florida. And besides teaching courses in media ethics and listening first, music, culture, and community, stereotypes in the media, and pop culture criticism, for the last 15 years, I recently started some of this publishing of Phish Studies research, which is just wild to me since I've traveled many, many miles since my first Phish show in '96 at Deer Creek. And we've seen Phish, you know, every day of the week, and you know, we go and we do this, you know, to hear this band play from Vermont. In 2005, when I was pursuing my PhD in rhetoric and communication ethics from the University of Denver, I met my husband in the front row of a Phish show, which was a Mockingbird Foundation benefit post-trade band in the fall of 2005. So it was on hiatus. Thank you, hiatus. It got me that PhD. And now our kids, Adeline and Dylan, they've seen enough shows to be upset if they don't get their preferred song choice of the night, and we love doing it together as much as we can. My brother is a Phish head, his wife's a Phish head, my friends from every stage of life, from grade school to grad school, have been my show partners for coming up on 30 years now. And at this point, shows are class and family reunions, and I am grateful for that. And they will be the first to tell you that I am not the secret keeper. I'm usually the last one that figures out the joke, and I usually have to have it explained to me over and over and over again. So, you know, maybe there's, you know, something there. Certainly my undergraduate self, the one who interned at Deer Creek for the summer of 1998. Concert season is thrilled to accomplish professional level Phish Studies, and I thank you all for coming and listening to my thoughts out all on the page, which is so nerve-wracking and risky. So just a brief side note, this that I'm going to talk to you today is a continuation. I'm a very layered thinker, and for me to even get to where I needed to go today, I have to tell you, I've been thinking through a method of Phish phenomenology. It started at the first Phish conference when I did the paper that brought up some of these key terms. So these are all the things that I've already kind of addressed, and so if I don't just speak on them quickly, I'll find myself rabbit holing right back into them. So unpredictability was something I talked about in relation to atopos, which was a rhetorical term that points to the out of place, the uncommon, placeless, nonsensical, anything beyond logic. In that same paper, I brought up familiarity, and I did that through some theory done by Morris with the fourth persona and his secret silent wink. Talked about a little bit of donut discourse, and eventually got concluded too that there's something about this immediacy that brings us this risky moment that gives us responsibility both for the band and for ourselves and our community. Flash forward to the next paper, which was published in the Phish Journal Through the Philosophy. This one I introduced a term called kisserole reasoning, which is multimodal argumentation that really addressed this energy, this reasoning beyond logic, out of the world spirit vibe that we all love and chase around. And then I also tried to tackle Bakhtinian dialogism with this push and pull that leads to this flux of an it moment that we all want. It's once occurrent, it's a moment of living. So where does that take us to today? As far as today, I'm trying to look at these out of place moments, but really with an underscore of the laughter of it all. Let's see here. Yeah, so this paper today specifically is exploring the textual layers of meaning constitutive of face atopos, or that out-of-place performance art, especially those moments when you laugh and laughing we all fall apart. Some other themes that I was kind of concerned with had to be with that comedic suspense, suspending what you know and what you think, focusing in on the ha-ha-ha, or that joyful sensation of being in the know or the flow, the ah and the aha, and the paradox of it all, of course. I mean, this is probably the most serious, unserious thing that we all do, right? And we all commit to it, and I think that, all my research loves a good paradox. So, brief preview of some of these major, research and progress. So, studying of the comedic context of Phish, look a little bit at the audience as pranksters themselves, but also the people that the joke is targeted to. Some of those opportunities and limitations embedded in understanding the joke or not understanding it. Some of the theory that I came across to tackle some of these themes of spoof, suspense, stage antics, gags, humor, and wit. A little bit of application analysis, and then some of these larger concluding themes. So that's what I'm going to try to kind of point to today. Okay. So, the comedic context. Barbershop quartet and a rock and roll show, the Electric Lux vacuum as an occasional instrument, drummer wearing a dress plays the vacuum, megaphones to drill on bass from flying hot dogs, a tower jam, an indigenous native reservation, airport runways, or on a racetrack. Phish performs subversion to expectations, to what is expected from pop rock, and to what is expected from a Phish conference. Phish is a mind-altering collection of pop cultural references, feeding the central theme to this everlasting spoof. From hidden messages embedded in setlist acronyms to musical costumes and guest star stage antics, Phish is a band that thrives on surprise and farce. Improvisational layers of phenomenon fuel the unpredictability of the experience. Phish does this by infusing an array of music genres and styles, type 2 jamming, and or various vamps alongside innumerable innovative stage frolics that alter each performance towards an authentic experience, both for the band members and for us, the devoted fans. Phish has a long history of humor and wit, and such funniness can be routinely found in their stage antics, gags, and stunts, and we can also find it amidst the peals of laughter that are sometimes nonsensical, peculiar lyrics that we all love. Trampolines and glider things, dry ice, chess, and a vacuum cleaner, rollerblades, beach balls, musical costumes, and guest star appearances. A secret language, secret surprise sets, musical mashups, and New Year's Eve stunts and shenanigans. So I went back and I tried to get some of the context from the band themselves. And I went to the David Byrne interview, 1998. If you haven't listened to it lately, go back. It's awesome. And he asked the band, and they're all sitting there. He says, "Speaking of stage stuff," asked David Byrne on October 20th, 1998, in an interview with the band for the PBS show Sessions. What's with the trampolines? Page rolls his eyes and giggles in the corner. And from the band, there's a quick pause before Fishman responds. Quote, those are, all those things where Mike jumps in are antics. And Byrne adds, "And rubber chickens?" laughing. Fishman continues, "Rubber chickens, yeah, and they're just like, these ideas are jokes that came up in band practice. Like, it wouldn't be funny if a handful of those actually ended up, and, someone would say, wouldn't it be funny if, those trampolines that we were just driving by, some lawn sale or something, like in South Carolina," and he corrects himself. He's like, "The origin story of the trampolines." Trey confirms, "Yeah, something like that," laughing. And Fishman goes on to the story. He says, "Let's grab these tramps, and they were cheap." Fishman drifts, and Trey chimes in, well, they're mini tramps we had, and slippery slides for a while. Too, those look really cool, Fishman picks back up the story, and he says, "Yeah, there's a song, it's Ice, and wouldn't it be funny if some of those, actually end up going to buy these things, and then sooner or later you end up with a trampoline or slick and slatter, or you just see it at a lawn sale, and they just end up getting incorporated, and some of them actually stick." And then Trey jumps in there. He goes, "Did you ever see Devo?" To Byrne, and he says, "Yeah." Trey continues, "They used to walk out on treadmills," and they're like, "Yeah, that's a great idea," laughing. And the interview goes on, and Trey tosses his hands up and says, "It's all taken from Devo." Even more laughter. And then Fishman closes, "Man, he exposed our one truth," even more, laughter. So that was the Byrne one. I did a little bit of other research with the Sphere stuff coming up. I'm sure some of you heard some of the interviews. Trey was saying, we've done a lot of large-scale events, quote, "It's a strange subtext to what we do as a band. We're pretty comfortable. We've developed a language and a team that can really move in that world. We do full theatrical production with actors regularly." And he's pretty confident in that. Quote, "Every year at New Year's Eve at Madison Square Garden, we put on a very large theatrical event, so it's made everything less intimidating." Let's see. So essentially, he was talking about stretching boundaries within the bounds of the sonic space. A normal Phish show is different every night, and it's not how most acts do it. So we used our love of variety, and we used some of those elements of the Sphere to build on that. They have to have every show be unique. It's just what we do. We're not a group, and we're not trying to be too literal or on the nose. So some of those were some of the things that came in when I was trying to set up the context. Now, of course, then I had to start thinking about who they were influenced by, right? Not the theatrical, and I'm so happy you did the puppets because I couldn't get them in there. But some of the other ones that I did find important to mention. Colonel Bruce, let's start there, right? I had to start, so I guess for me, I'm a big Fishman fan. I've always been a big Fishman fan. I feel like he's the biggest comic release on stage. For him, one of his biggest influence was Colonel Bruce, serenaded him, and then obviously was there when Colonel Bruce passed away in a really satirical, humorous way. And so there was a lot of great write-ups post Colonel Bruce's death of his influence both to Fishman in the band and also to Mike in the documentary. So let's see. One of the things that Fishman said about Colonel Bruce was, quote, "He made everybody comfortable in their own skin, and as a result, it always brought out the best in them. That's why he was always surrounded by so much excellence, not just in music, but in humanity. In intent," John Fishman reflects, and this was from the 2007 statement following his death, Colonel Bruce's death. Fishman continues, his mantra, Colonel Bruce's mantra, was, quote, "Intent, release, recovery." But everything always started with intent. Let's see. He also said, this is Fishman on Colonel Bruce. Besides the consistency with which Bruce valued intent and adhered to the now, and now with a capital N, he had an equally deep appreciation for the good showmanship and the extraordinary eye for talent. Fishman and Phish met Hampton, Colonel Bruce Hampton, in his aquarium rescue unit in 1990, teaming up with some 4 shows, including the Horde Tour. And on 11/28/95, Colonel Bruce, responding to his invitation to come on and sit in with the band, he did exactly that. He sat himself center stage, reading a newspaper to be serenaded by Fishman. Fishman underscores Colonel Bruce's influence, preluding the Wind Beneath My Wings serenade. Fishman says, quote, "I come clean. I am not a creation of my own will. I'm a creation of this man's will. Everything I am, everything I've done has been because of his operation of strings, of him being the strings of my puppet being." Let's see here. Mike Gordon quotes about Colonel Bruce, "Our jaws were dropped just watching him." This is on the Basically Frightened documentary. He says Phish started taking lessons from him. And I guess I'll end the Colonel Bruce section with one of Colonel Bruce's quotes himself. He says, "Never take yourself serious. That's so silly. Take what you do serious. And then there's nothing more disgusting than seeing a serious musician." So Colonel Bruce. Other comedic performative influencers that I kind of looked into, Sun Ra and Frank Zappa. Quote from Trey, "Both Sun Ra and Frank Zappa were extremely gifted musicians and composers. To some degree, their brilliance has remained unheralded, and as time grows on, the history will realize their true importance. In many instances, Zappa and Sun Ra sacrificed financial gains or media attention, which I think is really important for Phish and their relationship with the media, in order to maintain the integrity of their music. I think similar to Phish, the lack of media attention gives them a sense of freedom to be able to pull some of these pranks and jokes. Both avoided the manipulation of record companies and lived outside the spotlight that showed on so many other musicians. These facts can be attributed to the avant-garde and inaccessibility of their eclectic music. The real point is that they just didn't care, and as long as they created music, that was true, and they were happy with that. So I think that was a pretty interesting insight. In other words, that Phish, not having all spotlight on them for so many years, having this kind of in-group, secret, silent wink community, you're able to take a risk and throw out some jokes, and some jokes might land, and some people might not even know it's a joke, and you can just do it. And sometimes it's a just joke for your band and for yourself, and we can do that. We can kind of take the risk, and I think they saw that also play out in things like Sun Ra and Zappa. Obviously, another quote from Trey, you guys, when he's talking about Zappa, another huge influence. Zappa, I never met Zappa, but when Phish was just starting out, me and Phish went to a bunch of shows on his last tour. He brought him a t-shirt, tried to get his t-shirt on stage, got his t-shirt on stage, was part of an actual stunt or a gag. So, actually, I thought that was an interesting quote, because here you have Trey as an audience member talking about his experience of being a participant with an actual gag being played out through material rhetoric and exchange of energy. Fishman, he was drawn to the virtuosity of performances. For Fishman, who frequently performed or played along to Zappa in his parents' basement, so we know that that's been a big influence. Okay, Captain Beefheart. All right, I keep moving down. All right, and then also, even they were talking about, I came across a really funny quote on the Burn. Right, they actually wrapped the interview with him talking about the Groovegrass record, which was the Macarena, which was the Del McCoury band with Bootsy Collins, with. So traditional bluegrass, meets funk, and Mike was listening to the record at the time, and they wrapped the interview, and he says, Trey remembers, okay. Trey remembers one song in particular from the album that stood out. Quote, the Macarena, that's it, the best. That's really how he says it. Macarena, and he starts like playing around with his tone in English, like, Trey puts on his best bluegrass tone with an air guitar and says, Macarena. So to me, it's like not only do they see the humor in gags and stunts, but they see the humor and the words of the lyrics, but not even just the words, but how they're pronounced, right? So sometimes it's not about what's being said, it's just how it sounds. And so they all got a good giggle out of that. Okay. Oh, the Residents. The Residents. I, of course, went in to watch another documentary about them, realized that a lot of them are from like around Shreveport, Louisiana, which, that's a big interesting fact I learned about the way. Something about being kind of stuck and isolated in a confined community or environment and then breaking out to San Francisco to allowing them to expose that avant-garde. But Trey says at the Resident show at New York City's Beacon Theater in '96, he said, quote, a man grew from 5.5 feet to 11 feet tall on stage in about 30 seconds. That's from an interview or a write-up that said the concert that changed his life. And Fishman spoke on that same concert that changed his life. He says, quote, I couldn't speak for an hour after the show. Normally, there's nothing that I can keep my mouth shut for that long. And yeah, we all know about Fishman, right? So the Residents, right? Like, and those are the 4 eyeballs, if you don't know, so you can clearly see the visual influence. All right, enough about their past. But like that, again, rabbit holes, right? All right, so the audience. A little bit about the audience is who the text is written for, the joke from a rhetorical perspective, but I also think there's something to be said about how the audience can take up the joke themselves or create an off joke and spin that from the particular joke, and then that kind of traces it on, and they become pranksters themselves in the creation of art and t-shirts and stuff. Let's see, so Phish has, let's see, I think I said that. Phish has no shortage of jokes, hoax, farce, and or tricks, and they are well known to take the new comedy to new experiential levels for fans in the immediate lived experience and the immediate screened experience, and for those who will catch it on the replay, which provides opportunity to reflect on the paradox of suspense, in which uncertainty becomes a questionable condition for one to feel the emotional suspense. So that's actually one of the third theories, the paradox of suspense, that I kind of got to, because I'm always kind of curious, like, yeah, you got to be there to be in on the joke, or, can you experience it from couch tour, or could you like totally just catch it on the replay? And again, this was one of the first articles I read, so bear me if my memory is a little bit shaky. But what was so interesting to me is like, well, of course you can laugh after the joke is way over. I mean, otherwise, why would we go back and rewatch funny movies over and over and over again? Why would you go back and replay it? So there is something about being in the know, because you can totally not even know that it happened. I was talking to one of my friends who was at the Sphere, had absolutely no idea about Drew Carey, absolutely no idea that there was any theme, had no idea that any of that was part of it, and he was part of that lived experience, where certainly several of us were part of and on that gag through social media as the texts were kind of coming out. Of course, I'm getting ahead of myself. So it's always, something about the audience, right? And then so I found in listening to some of these oral interviews, the commitment that the band has for the audience. And if you listen to some of the CBS Morning News reports, especially when he was talking about preparation for the Sphere, that's where their intent actually is. Trey says, quote, Phish tries to attempt to operate at the highest level to honor the fact that these incredible people are giving us their attention, and it's not a casual thing. For example, there's going to be, and he says, quote, there's going to be things, in the walls of the content of the Sphere that the audience members will recognize, because of that long shared history, and, on purpose, like we did that, there's an Easter egg in there for the fans. So you can tell that his intent's there. Quote, he says, we have intelligent, focused fans, and we have to honor that, and they're not casual fans, and that's really cool. It's also an honor, and it's a massive responsibility. So up kicked my communication ethics, right? Flag, like, okay, he recognizes that he's got people that commit themselves to take it very seriously, and we have an ethical responsibility to that. Back to Trey. So the reason that you're going to see things like Cosbot, the Whales, the musical, the marching band, Walk Across Madison Square Garden all in 1 year is because I feel like the longer this goes on and the more we owe the fans, the more they have supported us for 40 years. Like, it's our responsibility to keep raising the bar, which has great challenge, and it's very unique. And it's really, if you really look at it, at the series of events we continue to put on, and that thinking goes, and the thinking that goes behind it, the fact that there were people in the audience of last New Year's Eve who have seen Phish 300 times who are crying, according to what I heard. And, Phish said, Trey says, I too, by the way, was crying. But he says that meant so much to all of us. Everything we want, which is to honor and respect the people that come, the people who have been coming to see us for years. We feel like they're family, and they deserve our care, our attention in every detail. And so, again, that ethic of care is a big deal to me because it's where I've landed the first two papers of my scholarly research. Okay, so they're doing it, they recognize us. It's about the audience. All right. So some opportunities, I know I'm getting out of time, right? But I will point out some of the opportunities and limitations. The opportunities are they can do this anywhere. It's a joke. It's, that people can get it and they could take the risk and you might get it, you might not, you might be on it, you might not. It might be part of the song, it might be part of the theme, it might be part of a meme on Instagram. It's kind of all over the place, so there's opportunities galore. What makes me even more interested is the opportunities of the problem of being in the know. Is a problem in this atopic, out of place moment, and being obsessed by it. It could create this loss of impact. Like it's like telling the same joke over and over and over again. You start to have a demise of obsessing over the unpredictable. And so this is where the trampolines on stage, which was like, well, look at these funny things that we saw at a yard sale, let's put this on stage, is now something that's expected. And if it's not there, fan critique would, I can't even imagine what people would say. Like, give them a break, they're getting old. Like, I can't even believe they still do it. Like now the drummer tours in a dress. Like, it's been a long time since we don't see him not in the dress. The fact that they put a hiatus on Halloween to kind of keep it fresh so that people didn't know. So there's always this problem of having to up the ante. And there always has to be a way of being innovative of the experience of a Phish phenomenon through these other visceral, nonsensical, beyond logical ways when they've got an audience who's on their tail at every turn. Reinvention of the familiar is essential to the circulation and flow of the trace, of the kiss roll and the connectivity. And by that, you can only really recognize it if you're in the know. And so that might also be a limitation to some of this humor. So like for me, like to kind of give you an applied context to this limitation is like they're so about immediacy and they're so about being in the moment. When you have to have a pre-planned theatrical moment, you already take that possibility off the stage. You guys all saw he's got a timer by his foot. He is never in the moment. He is always one step what's coming in the next moment. And they did a lot of work to create opportunities to protect that in the moment space so that if they did find themselves floating off into a jam, that they could, kind of hide that timer maybe in his mind, but I don't know how you would hide the timer, knowing that the rest of the show is still coming. And that's not just at the Sphere, it's like at any of these gag shows. Or like some of me and my friends say, or if there's a special guest involved, you can almost feel that free flow timing is off because they've removed themselves from the immediate to, what's coming next and being prepared for that. Okay, so I know I'm out of time, so I'm just two more things. So I'm just going to point out the theory I did turn to is old school rhetoric. I love that it's coming from like 1851. Found a really cool write-up in the Atlantic Monthly. Also in 1892, this is about differentiating the rhetorical impact and effects of things like wit to humor. Everybody gets humor, and it could be dark humor, like laughing at deformity, laughing at, run, OJ, run, right? Some of the dark sides of Phish humor, right, which everybody can get. But then wit is kind of an elevated sense of enlightened, intelligent, reflective, right, types of things. And so I've, come up with some interesting insights into some of those effects. I'm going to jump to this. And then of course, like, how do you, the dark humor and the good and the dark, what for ethical purposes, a lot of that comes back to intent. And if their intent is always for your delight, then, as you can see the progression of their humor, it's never really to harm. Like, even as much as they love to poke fun at Phish and they love to play Hold Your Head Up, and he hates that effing song, like, they're going to poke at him, but it's never in true harm, right? It's in ingest for delight and performance, and then he becomes that, and he integrates that into his performance persona as well. So the wit is not to ridicule, but the aim is really to divert by the oddness of the imagery, right? And so one of the things, and again, this is all kind of in work, and I won't bore you with theory. I want to make sure that we all have plenty of time for questions. But, when he got stuck up there, and whether or not he was stuck, is one of the things that I think we get kind of caught up on. And of course, he's got an interview released, and he said he was stuck. And I went back and rewatched that last night very late. And I was like, but does him getting stuck eliminate the possibility of it actually being a gag? No, not at all. And then you can look at some of the traces, right, and the layers of humor that, is built into this particular event, from the Saturday Night Live, the bad luck with the Zamfir flute, even the imagery that continues to circle, and you listen to the Bring in the Clowns or Bring in the Clones. They kind of tell you what's going to happen before it actually happens. And then even the visual elements, continue that with him floating way up high and everybody else is really low. So, even though there might have been some malfunctions and he's replayed that, I think that there's still some suspended farce and gag that surrounds that. And then we see that play out in the Beacon Jams and stuff. And so research, what I thought was so interesting is that, let me see. The job, really, of the person who's holding the humor isn't supposed to give up the gag, right? They're supposed to direct the attention away from the answer to that, and not to kind of pull back the curtain, so to speak, until they're ready to pull back that curtain. So the other thing too, of course, the sphere, you always end up where you start. I thought was a really interesting layered look at a humorous gag that he's got a lot of press leading up to it. What it actually was, I don't know if anybody will ever know, but I did think it was interesting that if you do a sphere, you always end up right at where you start. And then I started thinking about the Pac-Man shirt. If you play Pac-Man, you always end up back where you start. And if you went to the conference, you're going to end up right back where you start. So I kind of got caught up on that and the theme of that. Okay, so to get to some quick conclusions, because again, I'm sorry for taking about some time. I think when I'm starting to put it all together is I think that we all need to take what we do very seriously, but we don't need to take ourselves too seriously, right, in that moment. I think the band gives us a really good example of that. They practice really hard, they plan really hard, they communicate really well, and they put in years of practice in that, but when they get in the moment, they don't take themselves so seriously, and that's what enables this moment of free flow. I also, and there's a really great quote of Fishman saying, he's like, I can't take myself seriously every time I put on that dress, and I put on that dress every time before I perform. How can anybody take anybody seriously when they're wearing that dress, right? But he takes what he does very seriously until the moment that it's supposed to happen. And and then I guess for us to walk away from is that we can recognize the humor in life. It's everywhere, it's important, and it does suspend all that other chaos that we like to black out with our Phish phenomenon love. So that's it for now.
All right, so we have any questions for Kristine? And we have about 8 minutes, so we can open up the floor to questions for the entire panel. So please come up and use the microphones, please.
Hi. Thanks to you all. That was wonderful. I really enjoyed this morning. Glad I was up by 9. This is slightly less a question than a comment. You just got me thinking about it, and I wanted to share. I was thinking about these atopian moments and the loss of impact, and I hadn't really considered that, but it reminded me of the Animals show on 10/30/21, where during Turtle in the Clouds, afterwards, they didn't dance. And Trey was like, we didn't want to dance. We don't have to dance. We can do whatever we want. Right. And it just reminded me of this, that sometimes they are saying, forget it, we don't have to do this. I wonder when they're not going to be able to jump on trampolines anymore simply for, I couldn't do that. Like, I don't know how they do that at their ages, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, one of the things me and my husband talk about is that Chicago show when they brought the comedic troupe out, but it was also the summer that they had somebody had a sign that said, play Llama the right way, and I don't think the band liked that at all, right? And so I think that there's a couple moments where they're like, let's mess it up as much as possible because it's our way is the right way, right, type of thing. And I also think that, and again, they try, and one of the things that I think too about humor, I guess I kind of skipped over this whole section of like what humor does, like, you know, releases the tension of chaos in life. And it also, humor brings us back to the immediate, because when you laugh, it's a visceral, and you remind, like, you could be out in this crazy spacey jam, but like they always want to reconnect with the audience. And so like there's a quote that's what the hot dog's about. Like, it's them trying to reconnect with the audience. And so humor in itself, ironically or paradoxically, is used to recenter and bring us back to that immediacy, right? That again, if it's too planned, it's like, can it be how can it be immediate, right? Yeah, out of place makes it fun.
Anyone else?
Actually, can I speak to what you were talking about? I'm thinking a lot also about the idea of camp, and I'm thinking about a paper about that in the future, so thank you for the thoughts on that. But I mean, camp is essentially the ethos of so bad it's good, which we see often, not just in 2004, but that was, well, never mind. We see that sort of across so much of Phish. I'm thinking about You Enjoy Myself, which, if anyone's ever tried to play the beginning of that opening guitar lick, it's incredibly, incredibly difficult to play. It's incredibly sophisticated. You know, this is prodigy music. And then you put the lyrics on top of it, which are inane and ridiculous. And that juxtaposition of the actual brilliance and then the so bad it's good is everywhere. Which to me just, again, like stops you from taking any of it too seriously, which then lets you be even more prodigal in the extraordinary parts that are so mind-blowing.
Yeah. And here I am at an academic conference saying, don't take it too seriously, right? Like, it's all paradox. Like, it's that push and pull, which goes back to that centrifugal. And there's somewhere in that middle that we trace.
I wanted to, you just made me think of this, the ways in which that dog-faced boy from the 11/14/95 is almost funny. Right? There's almost a humorous quality to, in the middle of this incredibly dark jam that, like, I put in, it's on my Evil Phish pantheon, right? That also has a 25 to 6 to 4 jam in there. And, like, I was wondering if you were going to reference that, and like that they actually tease another band, right? In that. But that, like, Dog-Faced Boy as a ostensibly a love song, a heartbreak song, a pretty song, a very traditionally structured 2-minute song, right, is inserted into this very dark jam. And is there something witty or humorous about that? I'm also thinking of the fact that they played backwards down the number line right after the Carini on 12/30/12 at MSG, or coming out of the tweezer that, like, left everybody with their mind blown on 12/30/19. Instead of continuing, they did a Let's Go Blue chant, and then Trey just absolutely ruined the flow of the set by stopping and telling the Pan story for 5 minutes. And I was like, what are you doing? This is horrible. So yeah, I was kind of so bad it's good, and also your thoughts on the humor of that song there.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think you're absolutely spot on. It's funny, I actually totally, like, as I've been re-listening to that sequence, I didn't even catch that other sort of reference that you just pointed out, so thank you for that. And I think that speaks to how, again, my point about how these, like, lyrical moments just are so interwoven. And I think there is absolutely a humorous element to it. I think even in the recording, you can hear people, like, whooping and like almost laughing, I think, in that Dogface Boy when they're playing it, and it's like, this is such a somber moment, and yet people are just enjoying it because it's so surprising that it is, as you say, almost funny, and it aligns with other sort of lyrical moments that I was choosing between different shows to analyze for this, and one of the other ones that I was thinking about was, I'm totally blanking on the exact date, but it's from 1993, and it was one of the recent shows that Live Phish was like spotlighting on their like top-rated shows, where in the second set they start with like a 45-second introduction to David Bowie, and then they move into a cover of Jessica. Yes, exactly that, and it is amazing and is so humorous because they, first of all, the David Bowie does not start out in its typical fashion. It's really also dark and haunting, and then they quickly cut into a really dark and haunting cover of Jessica that is then interwoven with the Simpsons theme, and so it's like they're again that's another moment that I see this sort of lyrical overlap that, to your point, is absolutely this intrusion of like humor, and it is supposed to be intellectual, witty, but it is also just hilarious when they. It's kind of stupid. Exactly, yeah. It's like genius stupidity. The fact that they can take all these different songs and layer them together. So yeah, I don't know if you.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think Fluffhead, Carini, they got a lot of really, they sing about a lot of dark stuff in a really comedic, like, fun way. I don't know if not everybody probably even realizes that. So, I mean, that some of the stuff that they are talking about is, death or, terminal illness or, and then, it's done in a really kind of fun, lighthearted way. But that's what humor's supposed to do, right? It's supposed to kind of ease the pain of some of those more tragic moments in our life that humanity has to face. It's about acknowledging the human condition, being able to laugh at it, like a little bit that I'm learning is like you can laugh at it like humorously, like a fishman playing a vacuum. You don't have to be real witty to think that that's funny, right? Like that's just odd. It doesn't match up. Vacuum instrument, it's stuck to his face. It's facial deformity at its very basic level humor, but then as you kind of level up in your fandom, I mean, I don't know if anybody even could get to that Trey level of all the different places that he pulls to connect these long lasting jokes that probably started perhaps, when they were just in college that we're still seeing here 40 years later. And a lot of us have been part of them at different shows, right? Some of us carry those with us and make them our own. And then some of us might not even realize it happened and we could have been in the front row. But yeah, humor's supposed to soothe that pain, I think, and they do it in a really fun way that should be celebrated.
Yeah. Fantastic presentations, all three of you, and really interesting. This question for John. When you talk about the Aristotle filter, as it were, and the narrative arc, I'm curious because to me, I always saw that as Joseph Campbell and the idea of the hero. Can you talk about how the two are the two different, or are the two just the same with the different language behind it?
Yeah, Joseph Campbell was sort of the thing I said, okay, I'm not going to touch that because that's a whole other presentation. But I think Joseph Campbell, the hero's journey, so much of early Trey is reliant upon that, but also so much of the Dead was reliant upon that, and the structure into madness and to structure narrative that was the second set of Dead shows post 76. Obviously, Phish takes a huge amount out of that. Also, they're nerds, and Joseph Campbell is the basis of Star Wars, and Joseph Campbell is the basis of The Lord of the Rings and all of that. And so there's that fantasy world that they also grow out of so much. I think what to me is really interesting, and I was talking to some folks about this yesterday, is Joseph Campbell, Lord of the Rings, The Grateful Dead, Star Wars, all these things, they all take themselves pretty seriously. And in particular, when we think about the Dead, that's a really earnest band in so many ways. They're really interested in Americana. They're really interested in roots and our identity as American people. Phish has never taken itself all that seriously, which to me is very Brechtian. That is where the Brechtian element comes in. Brecht's biggest influence, the artist who most made Brecht was Charlie Chaplin. And that we see all over, in particular the hijinks from the 80s. And what I won't touch right now is the way in which I think psychedelics play into this, but I also think if we look at sort of the 1980s 1980s psychedelia of Phish, in particular Fishman's contribution to the 1980s psychedelia of Phish, that to me pulls away from Joseph Campbell. That actually steps away from the hero's journey and steps more into theater of the absurd. And I can't take this all very seriously because that palm tree over there is talking to me. So how seriously can I actually take this? But yeah, we can Joseph Campbell for days.
Yeah.
All right, we're actually past time, but then now I have one quick question.
Sure, I'll try to make it quick.
Yeah, make it quick.
Sure. Hi, thank you everyone. And I'll ask some of my other questions later and individually. But you brought up kind of the challenge in balancing between the immediacy and spontaneity and the pre-plan, and you also brought up Second City in Chicago. And I know for a lot of people, when Second City happened and when it became obvious that it was a pre-planned segment, after the previous night having gone through the cancellation and huddling for dear life, together in that rainstorm, that did not hit everyone in a positive way. Can you please talk a little bit about those risks and how playing with what for is a really real experience with a lot of risk and immediacy for fans, how that can fall appropriately or perhaps not so much sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, one, I was pregnant at that situation, so I do remember the letdown, and I was very aware of how, this is great because, it was Second City, and it's Harpua. How can people not be excited about a Harpua? And they weren't, and because they could really feel maybe the gag didn't land, the timing was off, they felt that it ate up a lot of the music or what could have happened in that spontaneity moment, and they didn't like the pre-planned. In fact, I don't know if that's just the only occasion. I know a lot of my friends that are fans that choose not to do a New Year's show because they don't want the gag. They love the gag or the Halloween, but that's not the experience that they want. They want to lose themselves. They want the band not to have that limit. Like the festival is, the best because you don't know when they're going to start or stop, except for, they do have a lot of things planned, but, that moment and being in the immediacy, I think is everything to get that connection. It doesn't happen right philosophically. It's not right before it happens because it's already pre-labeled, and it's not right after what's already over because it's done. It's already categorized, stereotyped, labeled, and you know what I mean? It's that moment. I think I talked about the last conference, this was 5 years ago, but the storage jam, the thing about the storage jam that was so great is experience it and not knowing that it was the storage jam, but also not knowing what was going to happen right before it happened. And so the it is the immediacy, and that's really risky because like we saw in Chicago, it didn't land at all. Right, but that's okay. Keep doing the risk because without the risk, there's no reward. There's no even opportunity for you to have the big, right?
And no offense to Second City.
Yeah.